They came with fire, steel, and fury, and the world would never be the same. Sail into the full saga of the Vikings, a tale drenched in blood, driven by power, and crowned with glory. These fearless warriors, daring explorers, and cunning traders carved their legacy with raids, battles, and bold adventures. From frozen homelands to distant kingdoms, their longships carried both terror and awe. Today, we uncover the entire story of the Vikings. The entire story of Vikings begins in a world carved by frost and fire, where mountains rose like jagged spears and fjords split the earth with waters as deep as midnight. In that dawn of the north, when snow whispered across valleys and the sea pounded ceaselessly against rock, the first Viking families gathered around their hearths, shaping life out of hardship and storm. The land was cruel, yet it forged men and women as hard as iron, their breath steaming in the cold as they hunted elk, fished icy waters, and bent their backs to the plough carved from bone and wood. The Viking man walked with an axe upon his shoulder, not always for war, but as an extension of his life, splitting wood, cutting through ice, and guarding his kin when shadows pressed too close. The Viking child watched him with wide eyes, learning early that survival came not from softness, but from strength mixed with cunning. Mothers wove wool by the fire, their hands deft, their songs a balm against the howling winds outside. When night closed in, the hearth's glow painted their faces gold, and stories of gods and giants filled the smoky air, binding the young to the old in a chain unbroken. The earth gave little, and so every gift was precious. Viking food was born of toil, black bread kneaded from coarse grain, fish pulled from fjord depths, and meat dried with salt when the hunt was kind. Children gnawed bones, drawing marrow as if it were treasure, while men raised horns of mead, celebrating small victories against the endless cold. Yet there was beauty in this harsh life, northern lights spilling green and crimson across the sky, wolves howling beneath their glow, and the stillness of snow covering the world in silence. In those early days, the village was not merely wood and thatch, but a living bond. Smoke curled from chimneys like signals to the gods, and each family knew their place within the whole. The Viking woman tended both hearth and field, her voice steady as she guided the household. The Viking child learned to read the sea's moods, the way wind shifted before a storm, the sound of cracking ice beneath careless feet. These lessons were not written, but lived, stitched into memory by need and survival. The gods were never far from thought. Odin's wisdom was sought when choices weighed heavy, Thor's strength invoked when storms lashed boats upon the water. To live was to believe, for without faith the cold was too vast and the dark too heavy. When the flames of the hearth dimmed and all was quiet, men dreamt of sagas not yet told, of battles far away, of journeys across seas no eyes had yet seen. Thus began the dawn of the North, a land that shaped its people as stone shapes the river, hardening them into the Vikings the world would one day fear and remember. And in the hush of that frozen world, amid the crackle of fire and the low murmur of ancient tales, the story of an age was born. The call of the sea came before dawn, when the mists still curled like pale serpents over the fjords, and the water lay dark as polished steel. In the hush between night and morning, the world seemed to hold its breath, and in that silence the first creak of oars and the groan of timber stirred like a heartbeat beneath the fog. It was here, in these deep inlets cut by glaciers, that the Viking child first learned the rhythm of the waves, watching as fathers and uncles pushed longships from their cradles of rock and ice into the restless waters. The Viking man stood at the prow, his cloak whipping in the salt-laden wind, his hand firm on the carved figurehead that seemed to gaze outward with its dragon snarl. To him, the sea was not merely a road, it was a living force, a test, and a promise. He had grown with the tides, tasting brine on his lips as naturally as bread, his muscles hardened by endless rowing, his eyes sharp from staring into horizons where sea and sky blended as one. Beside him, the younger ones watched and listened, hearts pounding with a mixture of awe and fear, knowing that one day the oar and the sail would also call their names. The longship was their teacher, its planks singing with every push of the oar. The sound of wood striking water became as steady as a drumbeat, and soon the Viking child found the rhythm, dipping his smaller blade into the fjord, mimicking the older men. Spray kissed his face, icy and stinging, yet he laughed, for this was the laughter of belonging, of being bound to the sea's endless song. The women on the shore raised their hands in blessing, voices carried across the wind with prayers to Njord, god of the ocean, that the men return safe with fish, trade, or plunder. When the sail unfurled, dyed with deep hues of red and striped with darker shades, it caught the morning breeze with a crack like thunder. The longship surged forward, light and fierce, gliding across the water as though alive. The Viking man at the helm guided it with steady hands, the tiller obeying his command. To those on board, the sea was no longer an enemy, but a companion. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries shrill and urgent, while the horizon opened like a promise of distant shores. On journeys near, they fished and gathered riches from the sea's depths, their nets heavy with silver-scaled herring and fat cod. The smell of Viking food, fresh fish, roasted over driftwood fires, seasoned with sea salt and wild herbs, became part of every voyage. On longer journeys, the longship itself became a world of its own, men sleeping beside shields, waking to the slap of waves against oak, always listening for storms that could rise without warning. The call of the sea was never gentle. It demanded courage, strength, and surrender. The Viking child who once played at the oar grew into a Viking man who trusted the waves as he trusted his own heartbeat. Each voyage carved him into something more part of the sea, part of the wind, part of the endless story of the north. And as the longship vanished into the mist, its dragon prow cutting through fog and foam, the land itself seemed to sigh, knowing that the sea had claimed its sons once more. In the heart of winter, when night wrapped the north in its longest cloak, and the winds howled like wolves across the snow, the hearth became the soul of the Viking home. Flames licked at oak and birch, sparks rising into the smoke-blackened rafters, as families gathered close, wrapped in furs, their breath mingling with the warmth of fire. Here, in that glow, the entire world of the Vikings unfolded not in battlefields or on stormy seas, but in stories whispered by lamplight, where Odin, Thor, and Freya came alive as though they sat among the living. The Viking man leaned back against the timber wall, his face carved by shadow and flame, the weight of the day's toil resting heavy on his shoulders. Yet his eyes glimmered with pride as the skald's words painted pictures no winter storm could erase. He drank from a horn of mead, its honeyed sweetness mixing with the scent of burning pine, and he listened as the gods walked once more upon the earth. The Viking child, small and wide-eyed, leaned forward, chin upon his fists, barely daring to blink, for fear he might miss the moment Thor's hammer split the sky, or Freya's falcon cloak carried her across the 9 worlds. The sagas bound them together. They spoke of Odin, the All-Father, who traded an eye for wisdom and hung 9 nights upon the world tree to seize the runes. The firelight seemed to flicker brighter at his name, casting shadows like ravens across the walls. Then came Thor, red-bearded and fierce, protector of mankind, whose hammer struck down frost giants and made the very heavens roar with thunder. At these words, the Viking child clutched his little wooden toy sword, imagining himself marching beside Thor into the storm. And always, Freya fair and fierce, who wept tears of gold and carried the fallen to her hall of the slain, her beauty and power making even the men nod in reverence. The air was thick with smells, both homely and rich. Viking food bubbled in clay pots at the edge of the flames, a broth of lamb bones, onions, and wild herbs, its steam rising into the rafters, mingling with smoke. bread baked on flat stones, its crust crackling as it cooled, and the children stole pieces when their mothers turned their eyes to the stories. Mead horns passed hand to hand, warming bellies as much as spirits, and laughter rose between sagas like sparks rising from the fire. Yet behind every tale lay more than comfort. They were warnings, guides, and mirrors of the world itself. To hear of Loki's tricks was to learn caution. To hear of Baldra's death was to know sorrow's weight. The Viking man nodded slowly as the words fell, for he knew these tales were as much lore as memory, teaching each Viking child who they were and what they must become. Outside, the storm raged against the thatch, but within, time seemed to fold. The ancestors themselves seemed present, their voices blending with the skulls, their faces imagined in the fire's shifting glow. The hearth was not just warmth against the cold, it was the bridge between mortal life and the halls of gods. And as the last words of the saga faded and silence settled like snow, every Viking knew that in these fireside tales, the past and the divine still walked beside them. Smoke curled upward from the thatched roofs, rising like pale ribbons into the iron sky, carrying with it the scent of burning pine and the faint sweetness of peat. Beneath that smoke, nestled between fjord and forest, the Viking village breathed with a rhythm older than memory itself. The sound of hammers striking iron echoed from the blacksmith's shed, blending with the bleating of goats, the cawing of ravens, and the laughter of children chasing one another across frozen earth. This was no place of idle comfort. It was the beating heart of survival, where men, women, and children bound life together with duty and song. The Viking man strode through the muddy lane with a bundle of firewood upon his back, his boots heavy with frost. His shoulders were broad from years of rowing and labour, yet his eyes softened when he passed his home, where smoke curled from the chimney and the faint cry of an infant reached him. For him, strength was not only for battle, but for the simple act of keeping the hearth alive through endless winters. The Viking woman, his wife, worked beside the loom, her hands quick and tireless, weaving wool dyed with berries and bark into tunics that would shield her family from the biting wind. Her voice carried as she sang, soft yet strong, filling the hall with warmth greater than fire alone. The Viking child ran barefoot across packed snow, fearless in his play, his cheeks red with the sting of cold. He carried a wooden sword, striking at shadows, pretending to be Thor himself guarding the village against giants. At his side, another child carried a small shield made of driftwood, their laughter ringing like bells as they practiced the art they would one day need in earnest. They knew no life apart from this, the sea, the soil, and the gods stitched into every heartbeat. The air was alive with the sense of Viking food. From one hall came the rich smell of salted fish sizzling over flames. From another, the earthy aroma of stews, thick with barley, onions, and goat meat. Women stirred great pots with wooden spoons, and children carried bowls to elders, learning through service that no one in the village stood alone. At the feast hall, benches were already laid with bread and cheese, horns filled with mead, and laughter rising as stories from the day were exchanged. Yet life was not only toil and hunger, it was bound by ritual and memory. When the sun dipped low, villagers gathered to hear the skalds weave sagas, their words stitching gods and ancestors into the very air. Songs of voyages, battles, and lost loves carried through the smoky rafters, lifting hearts beyond the hardships of earth. The Viking man beat time upon the table with his hand. The Viking child clapped along, and voices rose together, shaping a harmony as wild and fierce as the land around them. In the Viking village, every moment carried weight. The smoke that rose was more than fire's breath. It was a signal to gods and kin alike that life endured here, bound by blood, by duty, and by song. And beneath that smoke, the people of the north wove their days into a saga as enduring as stone. The day began with hunger, as it always did, for the air of the north sharpened the stomach like a blade. In every hall, the scent of smoke and hearth fire mingled with the first stirring of pots and the grinding of stone mills. Daily bread and Viking food were not luxuries, but the pulse of survival itself, hard won from soil, sea, and sweat. A Viking man rose before dawn, his body still heavy from toil, and took his place at the long table where coarse loaves of black bread waited, baked from barley and rye, wrestled from stubborn fields. He tore the crust with calloused hands, dipping it into broth, chewing slowly as if each bite held the memory of the earth that birthed it. The Viking child watched, eager, biting into a smaller loaf, its rough edges softened with a smear of butter, churned fresh from the goat's milk. To the child, this bread was more than food. It was proof that their mother's labour at the quernstone, turning grain into flour with aching arms, had not been in vain. Around them, the hall stirred to life, women carrying bowls, men stretching weary shoulders, and elders nodding slowly as steam rose from clay cups filled with morning ale. As the sun climbed higher, the village was rich with scents, the briny tang of dried fish strung along rafters, the earthy fragrance of root vegetables lifted from cellars, and the sweet, heavy perfume of mead resting in oak casks. Viking food spoke of the land itself, goat stews thickened with herbs gathered from hillsides, venison roasted on spits until its fat dripped into the flames, herring smoked dark and brittle, ready to be carried across seas. Every taste carried the memory of toil, the hunt in the forest, the net cast into deep fjords, the calloused hand guiding the plough through rocky fields. At feasts, the flavours became celebration. The Viking man lifted a horn of mead, golden and bubbling with the honey of summer blossoms, and drank deeply, warmth spreading through his chest. The Viking woman carved roasted lamb, laying slices upon trencher bread for children whose laughter echoed in the smoky rafters. The Viking child clapped as music filled the hall, chewing on cheese sharp with salt, savouring the rare sweetness of berries preserved in honey. On such nights, the fire burned hotter, and the sagas were told louder, for the gods themselves seemed nearer when bellies were full. Yet hunger never strayed far. Winters were long, and every morsel saved meant another day endured. Families salted fish and meat, stored grain in wooden bins, and brewed ale to last through the frost. To waste food was a sin against kin and against the gods. Even bones were boiled to draw out broth, their marrow sucked clean by eager mouths. The Viking child learned early that nothing given by the land could be taken for granted. Thus, in the daily bread and Viking food, the story of a people was written: hardship and joy, hunger and feast, the endless rhythm of work and reward. Every bite was a memory of earth, sea, and fire. And in the smoke-filled halls of the north, where laughter mingled with the scent of roasted meat and the tang of mead, life tasted fierce, enduring, and true. Kinship was the first law of the north, older than kings and stronger than steel. In the firelit halls, where smoke curled against the beams and shadows stretched long across packed earth, life was bound not by parchment or crown, but by blood and oath. Mothers, fathers, and kin formed the circle that no winter storm, no enemy blade could easily break. A Viking man carried his family's honour upon his shoulders as surely as he carried his axe, and every choice he made rippled through the lives of those bound to him. The Viking woman was the keeper of that bond, her wisdom woven into the very walls of the longhouse. She raised her voice in council as freely as she did in song, reminding her kin that strength meant little without unity. At her breast, the Viking child learned their first lessons: loyalty, duty, and the stories of ancestors whose blood still whispered through their veins. She taught them to honour the old ways, to respect the gods, and to remember always that kin were shield and sword alike. The hearth was the centre of all things. Around it, families gathered to share Viking food stews, thick with goat meat, bread torn into pieces and passed by hand, ale poured into horns that circled the table. These meals were not only to fill the belly, but to bind souls together. Each bite was a reminder that the land had been worked by fathers, the herds tended by mothers, the hunts endured by brothers. The smallest child, who gnawed a bone, shared equally in the strength of the feast. For every member of the family was needed if the whole was to endure. Kinship was more than warmth and laughter, it was also the fire of vengeance. To wrong a Viking man was to stir his brothers, his cousins, his uncles, an entire chain of blood that would not rest until balance was restored. The sagas spoke of feuds that stretched across generations, sparked by a single insult or a stolen inheritance, and of men who carried the weight of vengeance not for themselves but for kin buried in the earth. To betray kin was to be cast into shadow, shamed and nameless, a fate more bitter than death itself. And yet, kinship was also the cradle of joy. At weddings, families gathered beneath banners of woven wool, their songs rising into the night as mead flowed and dances shook the wooden floors. Mothers blessed the union with gifts of linen and gold, fathers clasped hands with pride, and children played at the edges of the firelight, chasing each other like sparks in the dark. In those moments, kinship was not only shield, but light, warding off the cold and the loneliness of the world beyond. In the Viking Age, to be without kin was to drift like a ship without sail, lost and exposed to the mercy of storms. But to stand among mothers, fathers, and blood-bound kin was to stand within a shield wall, stronger than oak, unbroken as stone. And so the Viking child grew, knowing that every breath, every feast, every battle was not their own alone, but part of a bond stretching backward to ancestors and forward to generations yet unborn. The warrior's path was not chosen lightly. It was carved as deep into the life of the North as the fjords themselves. From the moment a Viking child first wrapped his small fingers around a wooden toy sword, the whispers of battle began to call. The village taught him early that the axe was not only a tool for wood and harvest, but a symbol of strength, a promise of protection, and, when needed, a harbinger of vengeance. Step by step, the Viking man was shaped into a shield for his kin and a storm against his foes. At dawn, the training fields echoed with the clash of wood against wood. Boys lined in rows, their breath white in the morning air, raising shields of rough planks while elders shouted commands. The shield wall was more than a formation. It was the heart of Viking warfare, where each man's life depended upon the brother beside him. A Viking man learned to press shoulder to shoulder, to hold the round shield firm, and to thrust his spear through the gaps like a serpent striking from stone. Mist clung to the grass as sweat beaded on brows, the rhythm of boots stomping the earth beating like drums of war. A father stood apart, watching his son stumble, then rise again. His gaze was stern, yet behind it burned pride. He knew the path of the warrior was the path of survival. He himself bore scars, white lines across his arms and chest, reminders of raids, of ambushes in dark forests, of duels fought under the watchful eye of the gods. When he saw his son grip the axe tighter, saw him refuse to fall even when beaten down, he nodded once. The boy was walking the same road. The meals that followed training were no less important than the strikes of sword or spear. Viking food restored what battle drained: bowls of steaming stew, bread dark and dense, and salted herring pulled from the sea. Around the table, warriors young and old ate side by side, the taste of earth and salt binding them as surely as oaths. The Viking child listened to the tales told here of men who braved the storms of the North Sea, of battles where shield walls crashed together like thunder, of warriors who fell, but whose names lived forever in saga. Weapons themselves were treated with reverence. The axe was sharpened upon whetstone until it gleamed, the spearhead polished to a mirror's shine. A Viking man might carve runes into his blade, calling on Odin for wisdom or Tyr for courage. Before raids, he would trace the edge with his finger, whispering prayers into the steel. Armor was scarce, yet the courage within the shield wall was armor enough. Step by step, the warrior's path was walked, not in haste, but with the weight of generations pressing behind. A Viking man was not born a warrior, he was shaped into one, moulded by hunger, by kinship, by the unyielding demands of a harsh land. And when the horn sounded, when ships slipped from fjords into unknown seas, he knew his place, shield to shield, axe in hand, standing as one with the line. For in that wall of wood and iron, the heart of the Viking age beat strongest, and every blow struck there echoed into eternity. They were spoken of in whispers, even around the hearth, as if the very act of naming them might stir their spirits from the dark. The berserkers, those wild fighters who walked the line between man and beast, were the shadow of the north, wrapped in both fear and awe. To see one on the battlefield was to glimpse fury itself, a storm of flesh and steel, half man, half beast, whose eyes burned with madness and whose voices rose in howls that chilled the blood. They were kin to no law but their own rage, and yet every Viking man feared and admired them in equal measure. The sagas said they were chosen by Odin himself, bound to frenzy as his wolves and ravens were bound to war. Clad in bear hides or wolf pelts, they strode into battle without mail, their chests bare, their muscles quivering, their skin painted with runes of power. Arrows that pierced lesser men seemed to glance away from them. Blades that cut others barely slowed their charge. To a Viking child, the tales painted them as giants of legend, unbreakable, unstoppable, as though the fury of Thor himself coursed through their veins. In the village, their presence was unsettling. When a berserker passed, men lowered their eyes, women drew children close, and silence lingered until the figure had gone. Yet when danger threatened, no one questioned their place. For all the fear they inspired, the berserkers were the shield that turned battle. Their roars alone could shatter courage, and when they crashed against the enemy shield wall, it was as if a mountain had fallen upon men. Feasts revealed their other side, though rarely. Around long tables laden with Viking food, the berserker sat apart, drinking deep from horns of mead, his eyes still distant, as though the battle within him had never ended. Roasted boar and fish were brought forth, bread thick with grains, stew rich with goat meat, yet even in celebration, the wild fighters seemed restless, their jaws working as if every bite were part of the same frenzy that ruled their swords. Many feared the cost of their gift. Mothers warned sons never to envy the berserker's path, for it was one of fire and solitude. Some said the rage burned too long, consuming even kin, leaving men hollow when the fury ebbed. Others whispered that the berserker's soul could never know peace, that even in death they would wander, neither welcomed by Freya nor feasted in Odin's hall. Still, when the call of war sounded and longships set sail, every Viking man hoped a berserker stood among them, for victory seemed nearer with such wild might at their side. In the shadows of the berserkers, fear and reverence became one. They were not merely warriors, but omens, reminders of the raw, untamed heart of the north. To stand beside them was to feel the world shake. To face them was to meet doom itself. And so their legend grew, carried in whispers by firelight, etched into the memory of every Viking child, until their name was as eternal as the sagas themselves. When the northern sky turned red with sunset, and the last horn of mead was drained by the fire, thoughts turned toward what lay beyond the grave. For every Viking man, death was not the end, but a doorway into realms of dread or glory. The sagas told of Valkyries radiant and fearsome maidens of Odin who rode the storm clouds on winged horses, their armour gleaming like lightning, their eyes fierce as the winter Sunday. It was they who chose the fallen, plucking the bravest souls from battlefields, guiding them upward to the golden gates of Valhalla. The Viking child listened wide-eyed as the old skald spoke by firelight, his voice low and steady, weaving tales of the hall of the slain. In Valhalla, the chosen warriors feasted endlessly, their wounds healing with every dawn, their laughter echoing across the rafters as mead flowed in rivers and roasted boar was carved night after night. To die well was to live forever, side by side with the gods, training each day for Ragnarok, when the final battle would summon all to stand once more against chaos. For a Viking man, this promise was as sharp as his blade, giving meaning to every wound and every drop of blood spilled. Yet not all souls found glory. Those who lived dishonourably, who broke oaths or shrank from duty, were said to be cast into hell's cold embrace. Hell, the silent queen, ruled a realm not of fire but of endless chill, where shadows wandered hungry and forgotten. The Viking woman warned her children that to be false to kin or cowardly in battle was to walk forever in her icy halls, far from the warmth of gods and family. The very thought made the hearth's glow seem brighter, its warmth more precious, for beyond it loomed a darkness no flame could pierce. Feasts reminded the living of what awaited. Viking food steaming stews, salted fish, black bread, and mead was shared with gratitude, for each meal echoed the eternal banquet of Valhalla. The Viking man raised his horn not only to kin beside him, but to ancestors watching from beyond, their spirits seated at Odin's table. Children were taught that every act of bravery, every sacrifice, was a step closer to joining those halls. Dreams often carried the presence of Valkyries. Men swore they had seen them gliding through smoke after battle, their hair streaming like fire, their hands touching the fallen with both tenderness and command. Mothers whispered that when a warrior's eyes went dim, it was not death he saw, but the shining vision of a maiden carrying him upward on a horse that galloped faster than the wind. In the end, the afterlife was more than belief, it was the compass of every Viking soul. To fight, to feast, to honour kin, and to face death without fear was to ensure one's place among the eternal. And so, with each dawn, a Viking man lifted his axe, a Viking child played at battle in the snow, and women sang by the hearth, all knowing that every step, every breath, was watched by the Valkyries who chose, and by Hel, who waited in silence. The sea was restless that dawn, its waves rolling heavy against the keel of the longship, yet the men within it grinned like wolves scenting prey. The first raids had begun, and with them the world beyond the fjords would learn the name of the Viking. Oars dipped in perfect rhythm, their strokes cutting through mist that clung to the water like ghostly shrouds. At the prow, the dragon-headed ship snarled toward distant shores, its painted eyes glaring at the land ahead. Salt wind filled the men's lungs, mixing with the smell of tarred wood and sweat, the promise of battle thick upon their tongues. The Viking man at the oar rowed with steady power, his muscles forged by years of toil in both field and sea. Beside him sat his brother, their shoulders brushing, bound not only by blood, but by the certainty that today they would carve honour into memory. The skalds would later sing of these moments, but here, now, there was only the drumbeat of oars and the creak of timbers. Behind them, a Viking child, too young for war but old enough to remember, would one day speak of how the raiders vanished into fog and returned with tales of fire and gold. The target was not a fortress, nor a king's hall, but a monastery rich in silver, soft in defence, and strange in its silence. The monks lived by the tolling of bells, but that morning the only sound they heard was the crash of longships upon their shores. Viking men leapt into the surf, shields high, axes gleaming. Their war cries split the air like thunder, scattering gulls into the sky. To the monks, who carried no weapons but books and crosses, the sudden storm of iron was like the wrath of gods. The clash was swift, brutal, unyielding. Doors were broken, cloisters set aflame, and the smoke rose high enough to stain the sky. Silver chalices, golden crucifixes, and jewelled relics were torn from altars, their worth measured not by holiness but by weight. For the Viking man, this was the reward promised by long nights at sea, the treasure that fed kin and forged legend. Yet amidst the spoils, he also seized food and drink, for hunger was as relentless as battle. Viking food bread still warm, ale stored in casks, was taken and devoured on the very steps of the monastery, mingling with laughter and shouts of victory. For the monks, it was terror. For the Northmen, it was triumph. The Viking man raised his axe to the sky, shouting the names of his ancestors, believing the gods themselves watched with approval. He knew that beyond the fjords, word would spread like wildfire, that pale-haired men came in longships, swift as hawks, striking where no defence could stop them. And with every tale told, the legend of the Viking grew taller, darker, and more inevitable. As the longships pushed back from shore, laden with silver, food, and captives, smoke trailed behind like a banner of fire. The sea embraced them once more, their oars pulling them toward home, where kin would feast on plunder and skalds would weave sagas of the raid. And so it was that the first raids were remembered not as mere theft, but as the moment when the Viking spirit burst beyond its homeland, shaping the fate of kingdoms with axe, flame, and song. The river carried them like a blade, slipping into the heart of the land. Mist rose from the waters of the Seine as the longships glided silently, their dragon prows gleaming with paint that caught the pale dawn light. The Frankish shores lay ahead, rich with stone halls, jewelled churches, and markets heavy with silver. But to the men aboard, it was not wealth alone that stirred their blood. It was the chance to test themselves against kings and kingdoms, to carve sagas into the marrow of foreign soil. The Viking man at the helm steered with calm resolve, his eyes fixed on the towers that grew clearer with each bend of the river. His axe rested across his knees, runes carved into its shaft, a prayer to Odin whispered under his breath. Around him sat his comrades, shield rims touching, their faces shadowed by helms. They rode not only for treasure, but for honour, and for the promise that their names would be spoken in mead halls long after they were gone. A Viking child, too young to join but old enough to remember, would later hear these tales sung by the skalds. He would imagine the longships cresting the river like serpents, their sails swelling in the wind, the thunder of drums marking their advance. To him, it was more than war. It was proof that the North could stretch its hand deep into the heart of Christendom itself. When Paris rose before them, its walls of stone, its towers crowned with bells, the air grew heavy with the scent of fear. The Franks had grown used to whispers of these sea raiders, but whispers became screams when the horns sounded and the Vikings surged ashore. Gold and steel clashed in a storm that shook the city's gates. Arrows rained down, striking shields with the sound of drumbeats, but the Viking man pushed forward, his axe biting into wood, iron, and flesh alike. The battle was chaos. Smoke rolled across the fields, mingling with the cries of the wounded. The clang of swords against shields rang louder than the bells that tolled from the church towers. Yet amidst the fury, there was order, the shield wall holding strong, men fighting as one body, each trusting the other to stand unyielding. The Frankish knights, heavy in armour, thundered on horseback, but their charge broke like waves against the stones, for the Vikings moved quick and struck with precision, their axes finding the gaps in steel. When at last the gates were breached, the city's riches spilled forth. Chalices of gold, reliquaries encrusted with jewels, silks from far-off lands all fell into Viking hands. Yet, even amid treasure, hunger guided them. Viking food, barrels of wine, wheels of cheese, salted meats, was seized and feasted upon in the very streets of Paris. Fires rose into the sky, casting the city in a hellish glow, and still the raiders sang, their voices carrying across the smoke as if to defy both kings and priests alike. But it was not merely plunder that marked this day. It was the memory of defiance, the proof that no war was too high, no kingdom too mighty, to withstand the fury of the North. And so, as the longships pushed once more upon the Seine, laden with gold and captives, the legend spread like fire across Europe. The Frankish shores had been tested, and with them the resolve of kings, and in that clash the Viking name grew heavier, darker, and everlasting. England lay restless beneath grey skies, its fields heavy with mist, its towns scarred by war. Where once kings claimed the land whole, now the Danelaw stretched like a shadow across its heart, carved by axe and sealed by oath. Here the Vikings had not only raided, they had stayed. The soil of England felt the weight of their boots, the press of their ploughs, and the clang of their weapons. What began as fire and pillage became a new order, where Viking law took root beside ancient Saxon custom. The Viking man strode through streets once ruled by Saxon lords, his cloak brushing against stone walls, now marked with runes. He bore himself not merely as a raider, but as a settler, his axe still at his side, but his gaze turned toward land, wealth, and kin. For him, conquest was no longer only the scream of battle, it was the laying of boundaries, the swearing of contracts, the shaping of a kingdom forged by strength and oath alike. In villages, Viking food filled long tables, salted pork, barley bread, and strong ale brewed in the English style, but seasoned with northern herbs. The mingling of flavours mirrored the mingling of peoples. Saxon women stirred pots alongside Viking women, while children, both Saxon and Viking child, played together in muddy lanes, their laughter echoing where once cries of war had rung. What was taken by blood was now bound by family, for marriages tied conqueror and conquered, weaving kinship where only strife had stood. Yet the Danelaw was never without tension. To the Saxon farmer, the Viking presence was both a burden and a shield. Taxes in silver weighed heavy, yet the law of the North promised swift justice. Theft was met with iron, oaths broken were punished with exile, and disputes were settled before councils where both Viking man and Saxon could speak. The shield wall had become a court, and the axe that once split skulls now carved order into the bones of England itself. Still, the sagas of war had not ended. In the borderlands, swords clashed, where Saxon kings sought to reclaim what was lost. Smoke once again curled from villages, and the thunder of hooves shook the ground. But now, the battles were not only between foreign raider and native lord, they were civil wars of culture, where law itself was contested. The Danelaw stood as proof that conquest could reshape not just borders, but the very heart of a land. The Viking child born on English soil knew no homeland but this, hearing both Saxon hymns and Norse sagas sung at the hearth. His world was one of mingled tongues, where he learned to plough fields with Saxon tools and wield an axe with Viking ferocity. For him, there was no division, only the life carved by his forebears, where law and blood stood as shields against chaos. Thus, England divided became England remade, a patchwork of crowns and contracts, its soil stained with battle, yet seeded with new beginnings. The Danelaw endured not only in rule but in memory, its echo still found in place names, in language, in the very stones of the land. It was here that the Viking story grew deeper, not just as destroyers, but as builders, leaving behind more than fire, a legacy of law carved by steel and sealed by kin. The wind off the fjords carried with it the sound of bells, a strange echo mingling with the cries of gulls and the crash of waves against rock. This was the time of Olaf Tryggvason, a man who rose from exile and storm to claim Norway not only with the edge of his sword, but with the weight of a new faith. His tale was sung in halls where smoke clung to beams and the mead horn passed from hand to hand, a saga of a Viking man who bound cross and steel together, forever changing the north. Olaf had been a wanderer, raised on distant shores after his father's death, hardened by years among raiders and merchants alike. He grew into a warrior of unmatched skill, his axe sharp, his shield unbroken, his voice carrying the command of kings. Yet he returned to Norway not as a mere raider, but as a man with a vision, to weld the scattered clans under one rule, and to bring them to the white Christ. For Olaf, the cross was no gentle symbol. It was a banner carried beside the sword, a sign that the old gods were fading and the new would rise in their place. The Viking man who followed Olaf marched with both awe and unease. They had been raised on the sagas of Odin, Thor, and Freya, their oaths sworn upon sacred groves and stone altars. Yet Olaf's words burned like fire. He promised unity, he promised glory, and he promised that those who bent the knee would share in his power. The Viking child listened from the shadows of the hall, wide-eyed as Olaf spoke, the golden crucifix at his neck gleaming against his mail. To the child, it seemed as though he bore the light of some higher flame, yet his hand still rested on the hilt of a sword as sharp as any chieftain's. When Olaf rode into the villages, his commands were swift and uncompromising. Idols of the old gods were torn down and cast into fire, sacred groves cut to the ground. Some submitted willingly, drawn by the promise of protection and order. Others resisted, their cries rising into the night as steel clashed against steel. Viking men who clung to Thor's hammer found themselves forced to choose, yield and be baptized, or stand defiant and fall beneath Olaf's sword. But Olaf also gave feasts, for he knew the hearts of his people. Viking food platters of roasted lamb, stews thick with herbs, bread fresh from stone ovens, was laid before those who came to hear him. He raised cups of mead and wine, speaking not only of Christ but of kinship, of law, of a Norway united by one faith and one crown. Around those tables, men who once doubted felt their resistance waver, for Olaf's strength was not only in his weapon, but in the certainty of his vision. And so the tale of Olaf Tryggvason spread, a Viking king who bore both cross and sword, who carved faith into the very bones of Norway. Some called him tyrant, others saviour, but none could deny that he had changed the path of the north. For where once the sagas told of Odin's ravens and Thor's hammer, now they began to echo with the sound of church bells, ringing across fjords, once silent save for the howl of the wind. The sea was his throne before any crown was laid upon his brow. Sweyn Forkbeard, son of Denmark, carried himself like a storm, given flesh, a Viking king, whose sails darkened horizons, and whose name sent shivers through halls from the Baltic to the English coast. He was no mere raider, no passing shadow on the tide. He was the lord of the North Sea, and his story was written in the clash of iron and the smoke of burning towns. From youth, Sweyn was marked for rule. The Viking man who sired him was King Harald Bluetooth, famed for binding Denmark beneath the cross. Yet Sweyn's heart was iron, restless and unyielding, and he rose against his own father, seizing power with sword and cunning. In him lived the raw fire of the Viking age, a hunger that could not be satisfied with fields or farms. Where others settled, Sweyn set his eyes across the waves, for he knew the North Sea was not a barrier, but a road, and every kingdom that touched its waters was his to test. His fleets were the terror of Christendom. Longships by the hundred poured from Denmark's harbours, their dragon prows snapping foam, their sails swollen with wind like the wings of ravens. The Viking man at the oar rowed with fierce pride, knowing that under Sweyn's banner, silver and glory would follow. Villages along the English coast saw their churches aflame, their bells silenced beneath the roar of axes. Monks fled with relics clutched to their chests, but no prayer could stay the storm. And yet, for every raid, there was also tribute. Kings paid in gold to hold back the tide, feeding Sweyn's coffers as though he were already their overlord. In the feasting halls of Denmark, Sweyn's victories were celebrated with abundance. Viking food filled the tables, platters of venison roasted till fat dripped into the fire, loaves of dark bread heavy with grain, fish pulled glistening from the sea and salted for the months ahead. Horns of mead passed from hand to hand, spilling over as warriors sang of conquered towns and shattered armies. The Viking child listened in awe, imagining the thunder of hooves on English soil, the crash of shields in London, and the sight of his king's banner flying above foreign walls. But Sweyn's hunger was not only for silver, it was for crowns. In time, he bent England itself to his will, forcing its rulers into submission. Even Ethelred, the unready, trembled and fled, leaving his throne abandoned as the Danes claimed dominion. For a moment, Sweyn Forkbeard stood not just as a Viking king of Denmark, but as the master of England, his power stretching across the North Sea like a shadow at dusk. Though his reign in England was brief, his legacy was a hammer blow upon history. The kingdoms he shook would never forget his fury, and his bloodline would carve deeper marks still. In Sweyn lived the essence of the Viking spirit, bold, relentless, unafraid to seize what lay beyond the horizon. And when he was named Lord of the North Sea, it was not merely a title, it was truth, for no wave rose and no crown stood without feeling the weight of his hand. The sea had long been the road of raiders, but in the time of Canute the Great, it became the spine of an empire. From Denmark's fjords to England's green fields, from the icy rivers of the north to the silver markets of the Frankish coast, Canute stretched his hand across kingdoms and crowned himself master of 3 realms. He was no wandering raider. He was a Viking king who turned plunder into rule, binding lands beneath his banner with both steel and wisdom. Cunut was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, born into storm and ambition. From childhood, the Viking boy heard the clash of shields and the crash of waves as lullabies. He grew into a Viking man, broad of shoulder, sharp of mind, his voice carrying command as easily as the blade he bore. Where his father had been the storm, Canute was the tide patient, steady, unstoppable. He did not merely strike England, he took it, rooted himself in its soil, and declared that the age of fleeting raids was over. The battles were fierce, painted in blood and fire. Longships slid onto English shores like wolves into sheepfolds, their prows gleaming with dragon heads. The Viking men within them pressed shield to shield, axes raised high, their war cries echoing across fields where Saxon kings once thought themselves secure. Yet when victory came, Canute did not vanish back into the sea. He stayed, claiming the throne of England as his own, his crown gleaming with the weight of conquest. Soon Denmark bent to him as well, and Norway too fell beneath his shadow, until the Viking child of yesterday stood as an emperor, holding together a realm greater than any his people had ever known. In his courts, both Saxon lords and Viking jarls gathered. The air smelled of ink and parchment, for law was as sharp as any sword. Contracts sealed disputes where once blood would have flowed, and yet, when needed, Knut's axe reminded all that the power of the north was no less fierce. He built churches as readily as he raised war banners, weaving old gods into silence while the white Christ's cross rose higher. To many, it seemed strange, a Viking man who bent before bishops, yet carried himself with the bearing of Odin's chosen. But Canute was a ruler who understood that power flowed not only from fear, but from the trust of those he ruled. His feasts were legendary. Viking food filled endless tables, roasted boar dripping with fat, loaves of dark bread, cheeses sharp with salt, and casks of mead and wine brought from far-off vineyards. Musicians played, skalds sang, and laughter shook the halls, as warriors who once fought against him now raised horns in his honour. At these feasts, the Viking child pressed near the hearth would hear not just tales of raids, but of realms held together by one man's will, and dream of a future where the north was not scattered tribes, but an empire united. Cunut the Great was more than a conqueror, he was the northern emperor. His rule stretched across seas, his legacy etched into the stones of kingdoms far from his birth. And though time would erode his empire, his name lived on as proof that a Viking could rise from the prow of a longship to sit upon 3 thrones, his power spanning lands as vast as the tides themselves. The waves had long been his cradle, and the horizon his constant companion. Leif, son of Eric the Red, carried in his veins the fire of explorers, and though storms battered his sails and ice threatened to crush his keel, he pressed ever onward. They would call him Leif the Lucky, for his journeys led him farther than any Viking before, to lands whispered of in rumour and dream. Beyond Greenland's frozen cliffs, he would bring his people to Vinland, where a Viking child first stepped upon wild shores, untamed by axe or plough. The voyage was peril and wonder alike. Long ships cut across waters that seemed endless, their sails straining against fierce winds. The Viking man at the oar pulled with stubborn strength, his hands blistered, his breath sharp in the cold air. Around him, crewmates muttered prayers to both Christ and the old gods, for none could say what lay beyond the horizon. The sea was heavy with fog, gulls wheeled overhead, and the creak of timber was the only sound besides the crash of waves. Yet Leif stood steady at the prow, his eyes fixed not on what was, but on what might be. When at last the fog lifted, the land revealed itself a coastline, rich with forests, rivers swift and clear, and fields that seemed to roll endlessly beneath the Sunday. The men gasped, for after the barren ice of Greenland, Vinland was a world overflowing with life. The Viking child ran ahead on the shore, his bare feet sinking into sand warm from the morning light. He plucked grapes from wild vines that clung to the trees, their sweetness bursting on his tongue. Never had he tasted such bounty, and when he carried the fruit back to his father, laughter rippled through the crew. They built shelters of timber, their axes biting into the trees, the sound echoing through silent woods that had never before known the ring of iron. Fires were lit, and Viking food was prepared from the gifts of this strange new world. Fish, fat and shining from the rivers, berries, sweet and abundant, meat hunted from forests thick with deer. Around the hearth, men spoke with awe of what they had found, a land where no winter starved the soil, where fruit grew wild, and where the rivers ran clear enough to drink without fear. Yet even in wonder, caution stirred. Shadows moved in the forests, strange voices whispered through the trees, and Leif knew they were not alone. Still, he named the place Vinland, land of vines, and claimed it as proof that the sea had no end that could not be breached by courage. For a Viking man, this discovery was greater than treasure. It was a new saga, one that stretched beyond raiding and conquest into the shaping of worlds unknown. Leif the Lucky's tale would be carried back across the seas, sung in smoky halls where children dreamed of distant shores. And though his footsteps on Vinland's sand might fade, the memory of that first landing endured, a reminder that the Viking spirit was not only to conquer, but to journey ever forward, chasing horizons until the world itself seemed endless. In the smoky warmth of the longhouse, where firelight licked the rafters and shadows danced across carved beams, the Skalds held dominion, not with sword or shield, but with words. They were the memory keepers of the North, the ones who bound the deeds of warriors, the love of women, and the trials of kin into sagas that outlived flesh. For in a world where winters buried graves and time wore away stone, only stories could ensure that no Viking man faded into dust. The Skald's voice carried like a harp strung with thunder. His words rolled through the hall, weaving images so vivid that the Viking child could see them as if they stood before his eyes. The clash of axe upon shield, the gleam of dragon-prowed ships cutting across stormy seas, the gods themselves striding through the 9 worlds. Each verse was a spark struck against memory, a flame that lit the faces of listeners gathered close, their bellies warm with Viking food and mead. A Viking man who returned from raid or voyage sought not only treasure but remembrance. Silver might be spent, and land might be lost, but if the Skald sang his name, then he lived forever. And so, after feasts of roasted lamb, black bread, and salted herring, warriors pressed coins or gifted cloaks to the poet, begging him to carve their deeds into verse. The hall would fall silent, save for the crackle of fire as the skald lifted his voice and transformed flesh into saga. The Viking child sat near the hearth, knees drawn to his chest, his ears wide to every word. He knew the stories by heart, yet each telling was new, each turn of phrase like a rune freshly carved. He heard of ancestors who had braved icy seas, of berserkers who fought with the fury of wolves, of maidens who chose death over dishonor. In those moments, he felt his own smallness, yet also his place in a chain stretching back through generations. For the skald's gift was not merely to recount, but to bind past, present, and future as one. The skalds themselves were wanderers. Some travelled from hall to hall, carrying sagas across mountains and seas, gathering new tales with every journey. Their cloaks were worn, their eyes sharp, and their tongues quick. They dined on Viking food at strangers' tables, slept beside hearths that were not their own, and yet they were welcomed wherever they went. For to host a skald was to host memory itself, and no lord wished his deeds to pass unspoken into silence. Even the gods were subject to their verse. Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunder, and Freya's beauty lived on in their songs, their stories woven beside the lives of men. In this way, the mortal and the divine became one tapestry, and a Viking man could dream that his own deeds might one day stand beside those of gods. Thus the skalds preserved the north. Long after flesh returned to earth and timber rotted from halls, their songs remained. In them, warriors still rode to battle, women still wept golden tears, and Viking children still dreamed of the deeds they too would carve into time. And so long as a single voice carried a saga, the Viking spirit could never truly fade. The North was shaped not by men alone, but by women whose voices carried through hearth and hall, whose hands wove the very fabric of life, and whose strength, though quieter than steel, was no less enduring. Women of the North stood as shield maidens, seers, and mothers, wielding power both seen and unseen. In their presence, the Viking man found counsel, the Viking child found comfort, and the sagas themselves found balance, for without them the tale of the North would be half told. By the hearth, the Viking woman reigned as keeper of kin. Her hands kneaded black bread, stirred steaming pots of Viking food, and spun wool into garments dyed with the deep colours of berries and bark. Yet her labour was not only survival, it was the shaping of memory. She sang while she worked, her voice carrying ancient songs that linked the child at her knee to ancestors long buried beneath the sod. In her song, courage and tenderness mingled, teaching the young that strength was more than the axe, it was the hearth that burned against winter's endless night. Some women bore steel, as well as spindle. The shield maiden was no myth whispered by fireside, but a truth known by those who saw her march to battle. She bound her hair in braids, lifted shield and sword, and took her place in the shield wall beside fathers and brothers. The Viking man who fought at her side did not question her courage, for he knew her spirit was as fierce as his own. When the clash of axes rang, when the line pressed forward, her cry carried as sharp as any warrior's, and in the sagas her name was remembered not as wife or daughter, but as fighter, fierce and free. Others wielded a different power, one that moved through shadow and silence. The seeress, wrapped in cloaks heavy with beads and bone charms, walked between the worlds. Her staff tapped the earth as she entered the hall, and men who feared nothing in battle lowered their eyes before her. She read omens in the flight of ravens, in the bones cast upon the ground, in the flicker of flame and smoke. A Viking child watched her with awe and dread, for her words could shape the course of voyages, wars, and even the fates of kings. It was said she carried the ear of the gods themselves, and her warnings were never dismissed lightly. But above all, women of the North were mothers, the living heart of kinship. They bore sons and daughters into a harsh world, raised them with discipline and love, and bound families together with wisdom as strong as any iron band. A Viking man returning from sea bent low to kiss the brow of the woman who had kept his home, tended his fields, and taught his children. For though sagas sang of battles and voyages, the quiet strength of mothers ensured that the village endured long after the clash of axes had faded. Thus, women of the north stood as pillars of the Viking age, fierce in battle, wise in spirit, and steadfast in hearth. They carried both sword and song, prophecy and plough, weaving threads of fate unseen by men yet felt in every breath of the north. And so their legacy lived, as eternal as the sagas sung beside the fire. At the edge of the known world, where mountains rose like jagged teeth, and forests stretched dark and unbroken, lay the pagan frontier. Here, beyond the reach of kings and the ringing of church bells, the old ways still ruled. Spirits haunted the rivers, the northern lights danced like burning banners in the sky, and sorcery lingered in every shadow. To a Viking man who sailed these frozen coasts, or trekked the tundra with traders, it was a land of awe and unease. The gods of Asgard felt nearer here, yet so too did powers older still, nameless and wild. The Lapps and Finns walked this frontier as though it belonged to them, their lives bound to reindeer herds and the shifting seasons. Clad in furs that shimmered with frost, they moved with silence across snowfields where a Viking child would stumble. Their tongues spoke strange words, filled with chants and whispers, and their drums beat rhythms that seemed to stir the very air. The Viking man who traded with them brought silver, iron, and salt, but what he received in return often seemed more than goods. Charms carved from bone, talismans painted with runes unknown, and herbs that promised visions, these were treasures of a different kind, born from sorcery and snow. Nights in this frontier were heavy with silence, broken only by the cry of wolves and the hiss of wind through the pines. By firelight, the Lapp shamans cast their spells, their eyes clouded as if they gazed into worlds unseen. Even the bravest Viking man lowered his voice in their presence, for it was said they could summon storms to sink ships or call forth spirits to whisper secrets of the future. Some believed they spoke with the dead, others swore they could slip from their own skin and run with beasts beneath the moon. Yet despite the strangeness, bonds of trade and kinship grew. The Viking woman brought cloth, beads, and iron pots, while the Lapps offered furs thick as armour and fish dried for journeys long at sea. Viking food, black bread, salted pork, and mead was shared with their reindeer meat and bitter herbs. Around the fire, tales passed between them, half understood yet deeply felt. A Viking child might taste unfamiliar broth and hear a story of spirits dwelling beneath lakes, carrying that memory home as if it were a saga itself. But danger was never far. The frontier tested every man's courage. Blizzards could swallow whole caravans, rivers iced over without warning, and unseen forces seemed to press from the darkness. The Viking man who braved these lands carried not only axe and shield, but charms tied at his belt, prayers whispered to Odin and Thor, and wary respect for the powers that walked unseen in the snow. Thus the pagan frontier stood as both border and mirror, where the Viking spirit met other worlds, where faith in the Aesir mingled uneasily with sorcery older than time. Here, in the far reaches of the north, the sagas were not only sung by men, but by the wind, the wolves, and the endless silence. And every Viking child who heard of these lands learned that beyond the known lay wonder, fear, and the mystery of the gods themselves. The rivers of the east were unlike the fjords of home. They wound deep through forests that stretched for days, their waters dark and heavy, carrying with them the whispers of strange lands. It was along these veins of earth that the Vikings, known here as Varangians, carved a new path. Where the sea had carried them west to England and Francia, now the rivers bore them south toward Kiev and beyond, to the golden walls of mighty Byzantium. A Viking man stood at the stern of his ship, steering through waters where mist clung to the reeds and the cries of unseen birds echoed from the banks. Around him, the crew rowed with steady rhythm, their eyes scanning the forests for danger. These rivers were lifelines, but they were also traps, winding through territories of Slavs, Finns, and steppe riders. The Varangians brought with them axes, shields, and iron, yet they also carried beads, furs, and silver to trade, for in these journeys war and wealth walked hand in hand. In Kiev, the heart of the Ruslands, the Varangians became more than raiders. They became rulers, merchants, and princes. Wooden halls rose along the riverbanks, filled with the smell of smoke, sweat, and Viking food prepared for men who came from distant seas. Mead mingled with honeyed drinks of the Slavs. Salted fish lay beside stews of foreign spice. Here, the Viking child heard not only the sagas of Odin and Thor, but also the stories of strange saints and distant emperors, carried on the tongues of travellers from the east. The journey south was long and perilous. Rapids tore at the longships, forcing the men to drag their vessels across the land, their shoulders straining beneath the weight of oaken hulls. At night they camped along the banks, fires crackling as they sharpened blades and shared tales of the wealth said to glitter in Byzantium. The Viking man chewed black bread and dried venison, washing it down with mead, his mind burning with visions of golden thrones and jewelled crowns. And at last they reached the great city Miklagard, the city of the world, which others called Constantinople. Its walls rose higher than any mountain village, its domes gleamed like suns, and its markets overflowed with silk, spices, and treasures that seemed beyond mortal hands. To the Varangians, it was as though they had reached a realm of gods. Some came as traders, offering furs and amber in exchange for gold. Others came as mercenaries, swearing oaths to emperors who prized their strength and fury. Many became Varangian guards, elite warriors clad in steel, who stood watch within palaces of marble, their axes gleaming beneath mosaics of saints. Yet even in this foreign splendour, the north lived within them. The Viking man spoke his tongue among comrades, drank mead when he could find it, and taught his son the sagas of home. The Viking child born in these distant lands grew up hearing both the tolling of church bells and the crash of longships on the Dnieper. And when feasts were held, Viking food sat beside Byzantine delicacies, a mingling of worlds at one table. Thus, in the east, the Vikings forged a new path, one not only of conquest, but of empire. They were no longer bound by the icy seas of home. The rivers carried them into the heart of kingdoms, into the service of emperors, and into the songs of two worlds. And though Byzantium's golden walls towered above them, the spirit of the Viking remained, fierce and unyielding, as eternal as the waters that bore them south. The clink of silver was a sound sweeter than any song, and in the days when the Viking sails reached far and wide, it was silver from the Arabs that poured most richly into their purses. Across rivers and steppes, beyond forests and frozen plains, lay the great trade routes of the east, where deserts burned with heat and caravans wound like serpents across the sands. Though few Viking men ever set foot upon those blazing dunes, their hands still closed around the coins that came from them, each one stamped with strange letters and carrying with it the weight of distant worlds. The journey began upon the rivers of Rus, where long ships cut through misty waters, their crews hardened by raids but lured now by trade. A Viking man, his beard stiff with frost, might unload furs of sable and fox, slabs of amber glowing like captured fire, or slaves taken in war. In return, Arab merchants offered sacks of silver dirhams, the coins gleaming as though kissed by the Sunday. To the Norse eye, the writing upon them was mysterious flowing curves and marks, unlike the runes carved upon stone. But to the Viking, value spoke more clearly than language. In the halls of Kiev and Novgorod, markets thrummed with voices in many tongues. Spices drifted in the air, sharp and sweet, cinnamon, pepper, and saffron, scents so foreign that a Viking child wrinkled his nose in wonder. Traders wore robes dyed in colours richer than any wool of the north, and they told tales of camels that strode like ships upon the desert, of palaces filled with marble, and of cities where towers gleamed beneath the Sunday. The Viking man, chewing black bread and dried fish, listened with narrowed eyes, his mind alight with visions of wealth and marvel. Silver bought more than treasure, it bought loyalty, honor, and power. With Arab coins, a Viking jarl could pay warriors through long winters, feed households with Viking food when harvests failed, and commission ships broad and swift for voyages yet unmade. A single bag of dirhams could set a feast, where roasted boar smoked upon the table, horns of mead passed hand to hand, and songs rose so loud they shook the rafters. For the Viking child, staring wide-eyed at the silver passed from palm to palm, it was proof that their people were no longer bound by fjord and farm alone. Their reach stretched into lands of sand and sun, where even the gods might marvel. Yet the coins carried more than wealth, they carried whispers of faith. Some came marked with words of the prophet, and though few in the north understood their meaning, the weight of belief was felt all the same. The Viking man, who prayed to Odin, or Christ, depending on the day, fingered the dirham and wondered at the world from which it came. These coins, carried by caravan, river, and sea, told of a realm vast and ancient, bound not by saga but by scripture. Thus silver from the Arabs poured into the north, glittering in hoards buried beneath fields, filling the purses of traders and spilling across the tables of feasting halls. Each coin was a story, a tale of deserts and camels, of spices and strange gods woven into the saga of a people who never ceased to chase horizons. And in the glow of firelight, as a skald let dirhams fall one by one upon the table, even the Viking child could feel it. The world was larger than any fjord, and the Viking spirit was destined to claim its share of it. They called it Miklagard the Great City, a name spoken with awe in every longhouse from Iceland to Kiev. To the Viking man who had braved the rivers of the east and the storms of the Black Sea, nothing prepared him for its sight. Constantinople rose from the water like a vision, its walls stretching for miles, higher and stronger than any fortress of the north, its domes gleaming like suns in the light of dawn. Ships crowded its harbours, sails bright with colour, and markets overflowed with goods so strange they seemed the bounty of another world. The Viking child who first heard of Miklagard sat by the hearth, his eyes wide as the skald spoke of marble streets, where emperors rode in golden chariots, of churches whose ceilings sparkled with mosaics brighter than the stars. To him it was more than a city, it was a dream of power and splendour, the kind of place where sagas found their highest verse. And for many Viking men, that dream became real, for they came not only as traders but as warriors, the Varangian Guard, bound by oath to the Emperor of Byzantium himself. The journey was long and perilous. Longships slipped from the northern rivers into the Black Sea, braving storms, pirates, and treacherous coasts. When at last they reached the city's harbours, the air was thick with scents unknown. Incense drifting from churches, spices sharp with cinnamon and clove, roasted meats and honeyed wines richer than any Viking food. The noise was overwhelming, merchants shouting in Greek, Latin, and tongues of the East, bells ringing from towers, and the clatter of hooves on stone. To a Viking man who had known only mud roads and wooden halls, the city was as dazzling as the halls of Asgard. In the service of emperors, the Vikings found both gold and glory. The Varangian Guard became a brotherhood of steel, their axes feared within the very palace walls. Draped in cloaks of scarlet, they stood beneath vaulted arches of marble, their voices low but their presence heavy as iron. They guarded thrones, escorted emperors in processions, and fought in wars that stretched far beyond their homeland's battles against Saracens, Bulgars, and Persians. For this loyalty, they were paid in gold, more than many had ever dreamed, and their names echoed in courts where no skald had sung before. Yet, even in Miklagard, the Viking spirit endured. At feasts, Varangian warriors gathered together, drinking mead brought from distant lands, sharing Viking food fish salted from the north, bread baked in the old way beside Byzantine delicacies of olives, figs, and spiced wine. In the glow of torches, they sang sagas of Odin and Thor, their voices rising in halls where mosaics glittered with saints. For though they guarded foreign emperors, they remained sons of the North, carrying their gods, their songs, and their pride into the heart of an empire. And so Miklagard lived in the sagas not as a city of strangers, but as a place where the Vikings carved new legends. Its walls, its gold, its glory became part of their story, proof that no kingdom was beyond their reach. For in marble halls beneath golden domes, a Viking man could stand as equal to kings, his axe shining in the service of emperors, his name carried far beyond the fjords of home. The North was never silent, but in those years it grew heavy, with a hush that seemed to press upon hearth and hall alike. Where once the sound of hammers struck upon amulets of Thor, now the ringing of church bells carried across the fjords. The turning of faith had come, and with it the twilight of the old gods. A Viking man might still whisper Odin's name before battle, but the sign he carved on his children's brow was now the cross, sharp and new, rising in places where sacred groves once stood. It did not come all at once. In some villages, the old rites burned as strong as fire, smoke rising from offerings laid before wooden idols of Thor and Freya. A Viking child held his father's hand as he watched the priest sprinkle horse blood upon the stones, the smell of sacrifice thick in the cold air. Yet in the next valley, a wooden church stood where a grove had been felled, its beams smelling of fresh pine, its roof crowned with a simple cross. Inside, the air was filled with chants foreign to northern ears, but their rhythm was steady, their promise of salvation steady as the turning of the season. Kings were the first to bend, though often with steel as much as spirit. Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson carried both sword and cross, demanding baptism from jarls and farmers alike. A Viking man faced a choice, to take the water willingly or to feel the edge of the king's axe. Some accepted with bowed heads, seeking favour or fearing wrath. Others resisted, their blood spilled upon the earth in the name of gods they could not forsake. Yet even as they died, churches rose from their ashes, beams nailed together where sacred stones had been pulled down. The hearth became the battlefield of belief. At night, mothers told their children both stories, the old sagas of Odin's ravens and Thor's hammer, and the new tales of Christ's birth and the saints who suffered for faith. The Viking child listened, torn between two worlds, his heart stirred by the thunder of Thor, yet comforted by the mercy spoken of in Christ. In his mind, the gods wrestled for his soul, one fierce, one forgiving, both demanding loyalty. Still, life pressed on. Viking food simmered in iron pots, as it always had. Black bread baked on stone. Salted fish pulled from nets. Goat meat stewed with wild herbs. Families ate with gratitude, knowing the taste of the meal mattered more than the name of the god who blessed it. Yet even in the sharing of food, the change was felt. Prayers, once spoken to Odin for good harvests, were now whispered to Christ, and where horns once toasted Freya, chalices were raised to the white Christ instead. And so the North shifted, step by step, until the hammer was worn less, the cross carried more. The old gods did not vanish in an instant. They lingered in sagas, in carvings, in the secret hearts of men. But the turning of faith was relentless, like the tide that wears away even the hardest stone. A Viking man grew old beneath the new faith. A Viking child was raised in its promise, and the gods of his ancestors slipped quietly into twilight, their voices fading but never wholly silenced. The North was a land of stone and storm, where no crown was placed without struggle, and no throne held without steel. Kings and thrones in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway were not bestowed by quiet ceremony, but by the roar of warriors, the clash of steel, and the oaths of men bound by blood. Here, a Viking man did not rise to kingship by birth alone, but by the strength of his hand and the courage of his heart. In Denmark, the Hall of Kings echoed with voices fierce as the sea. Jarls and warriors gathered beneath smoke-blackened beams, their cloaks heavy with frost, their hands never far from the hilts of their swords. A Viking man seeking to rule here had to prove not only his lineage, but his might, for those who bent the knee to him demanded protection, silver, and justice in return. Mead horns passed from hand to hand, toasts given in the names of ancestors, and blood spilled upon the floor sealed oaths as binding as iron chains. In Sweden, the rites were older still. Beneath the sky, where towering stones marked the graves of kings long gone, the people gathered to raise up their ruler. The Viking child stood at his mother's side, wide-eyed, as warriors lifted their new king upon a shield, carrying him high above the crowd. The air rang with cheers, and the sound of weapons striking shields, a thunderous chorus that seemed to call upon the gods themselves to witness the crowning. Yet the crown was never secure. Rivals watched with sharp eyes, ready to test his rule with axe and spear at the first sign of weakness. Norway, land of jagged fjords and storm-swept coasts, was torn by struggle between chieftains who each claimed the right to rule. Here, thrones were carved not only by oaths but by blood. A Viking man who sought power marched across mountains and valleys, binding some jarls with gold and others with fire. The skalds sang of battles where the very earth seemed to quake, of longships that carried kings to victory or ruin. Each victory feast filled halls with Viking food, roasted boar, steaming stews, and mead poured in rivers as songs praised the new ruler while whispering of those yet to challenge him. But beyond blood and feast, the throne of the north demanded wisdom. Kings ruled men as fierce as wolves, and to keep their loyalty was to balance strength with fairness. A Viking man who ignored his kin's counsel soon found daggers in the dark, while one who listened could bind his people tighter than any chain. The Viking child who grew in these halls learned early that kingship was not only power, but peril, for each crown rested upon a head never safe from envy. Thus, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway forged their kings not through quiet inheritance, but through the crucible of battle, oath, and sacrifice. Thrones were not merely seats of wood or stone. They were living symbols, born of the will of the people, the strength of the warrior, and the blessing or curse of the gods. And in those halls of kings, beneath the songs of skalds and the smoke of feasts, the fate of the Viking age was written, crown by crown, oath by oath, and blood by blood. The sea had long been their cradle, the axe their companion, and the shield wall their brotherhood. Yet there came a time when even the fiercest raider laid aside the sword to take up the plough. The saga of the North did not end in fire alone. It found new life in soil turned dark and rich, in fields where wheat swayed golden beneath the wind. The sword and the plough became the tale of Viking men who had once burned villages, now sowing seeds where ashes had fallen, shaping the land as lords rather than looters. A Viking man stood at the edge of a field in England, the earth moist beneath his boots, the smell of fresh-turned soil rising around him. His hands, scarred from years of battle, now gripped the handle of a plough. The oxen pulled slow and steady, carving furrows where grain would take root. Beside him, his son, the Viking child, watched with wide eyes, seeing not the glitter of treasure or the flash of steel, but the promise of bread and harvest. The boy's world was no longer only the sea and the saga. It was the soil, the sun, and the quiet strength of patience. The halls of these new lords bore marks of both raider and farmer. Shields still hung upon the walls, axes still leaned beside doorways, yet the smoke rising from the hearth carried the smell of Viking food, not from plunder, but from fields they owned. Roasted lamb fattened on English pastures, stews thick with barley grown in their own soil, bread dark and dense from rye that bent beneath their scythes, all of it tasted of permanence. The Viking woman moved among these halls as both lady and worker, her spindle humming beside her loom, while her eyes oversaw the stores of grain and meat, ensuring her kin would endure the coming winter. But the sword was never far from reach. Though the plough had claimed many hands, the memory of raids and feuds remained. A Viking man could walk his fields in peace one day and ride to war the next, for rivals and kings were never content to let new lords rest. Fields could be burned as easily as they were sown, and the ox that pulled the plough might be led away to haul the spoils of war. Still, the balance held the land needed tending, and with each passing season the furrows grew deeper, the harvest more abundant. In the evenings, after the day's toil was done, families gathered at long tables where Viking food bound them together as once the shield wall had. Horns of mead were raised not only to Odin or Christ, but to the promise of life renewed. The Viking child, drowsy from play, leaned against his father's arm, listening as skalds still sang of voyages and battles, though now their verses also spoke of land claimed, families rooted, and legacies that would endure in soil as well as in saga. Thus, the sword and the plough became two halves of the same story. The Viking spirit was not diminished by farming, it was transformed. Where once the longship carried men to fire and blood, now the furrow carried seed to bread and feast. And though the warrior still lived within, the land taught him another kind of strength, patience, endurance, and the quiet triumph of watching life grow where once only ashes lay. The sea that had once carried fear into every shore now grew strangely quiet. Where dragon-prowed longships had swept like shadows over the waves, castles now loomed upon the coasts, their towers of stone bristling with guards. The end of raiding had come, not in a single storm or battle, but in the slow hardening of kingdoms, the closing of doors once left unguarded. The Viking sails that once darkened horizons began to fade into memory, their fury checked by walls of stone and crowns that no longer trembled. A Viking man, grey at the temples, stood upon a cliffside and gazed out at the fjord, where ships once launched in glory. He remembered the thunder of oars, the crash of shields, the cries of monks and kings as gold spilled into his hands. Yet now the harbours lay still, the young turning ploughs through earth rather than steering keels across seas. In his chest, pride mingled with sorrow. The world that had once bent before the axe no longer feared it. The halls of Europe had learned. Castles rose like mountains, their walls too thick for fire, their gates too strong for axe. Knights clad in iron rode out against raiders, their lances gleaming in the sunday. No longer did villages fall with ease. Now even the smallest towns bore watchtowers, bells ready to sound at the first sight of sail. The Viking man who once stormed undefended shores found himself repelled, his fury blunted by stone and steel. In the longhouses of the north, life shifted. Viking food was still laid upon the tables, stews of lamb, bread dark with barley, fish smoked over oak. But it was earned now by fields and herds, not by plunder. Feasts still roared with laughter and song, but the tales of raids grew older, sung by skalds as memories rather than promises. The Viking child listened with shining eyes, imagining longships cutting across the sea. Yet when he stepped into the yard at dawn, it was not to train for war, but to herd goats, to turn soil, to learn the work that bound him to the land. The gods, too, seemed quieter. Odin's ravens no longer guided fleets across stormy waters, and Thor's hammer was invoked less for raids than for harvests. The cross rose higher upon the hills, bells ringing where once war cries had echoed. To many, the sagas of raiding became not instruction, but legend, grand tales of a time when their people ruled the waves. Yet even as the era waned, the spirit endured. The Viking man who now sowed fields still bore scars upon his hands from sword and shield. He carried his axe to the plough as much as to the hunt, and in the hearth-fire's glow he told his children of the days when their kin had walked boldly into foreign halls and bent kings to their will. The Viking child, listening, felt the echo of that spirit, even if he would never see the sails rise against the southern Sunday. Thus the end of raiding came not as defeat, but as transformation. The world had hardened, kingdoms had risen, and the axe no longer ruled the seas. Yet the memory of those sails lingered, painted in sagas and carved in stone, so that long after the raids had ceased, the name Viking still stirred both awe and dread, as eternal as the sea itself. Night in the north was long and heavy, its silence broken only by the crackle of the hearth and the low chant of the skald. Legends and dark omens clung to the smoke that wound through the rafters, whispering of serpents that circled the seas, of dragons that stirred beneath mountains, and of Ragnarok, the doom of gods and men alike. To a Viking man, these were not mere tales. They were warnings, woven into the marrow of his life, shaping how he fought, how he feasted, and how he faced the end. By firelight, the skald's voice rose, his words painted with dread. He spoke of Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, so vast its body wrapped the earth, its breath fouling the seas with poison. He told of Fafnir, the dragon whose greed burned hotter than flame, guarding hoards of gold no man could claim without cost. And he sang of the Norns, weaving threads of fate that even Odin himself could not unbind. The Viking child, seated cross-legged by the hearth, clutched his wooden toy sword tight, eyes wide as though shadows in the hall might suddenly coil into serpents. These omens lived not only in words, but in the world itself. When storms rolled in sudden and fierce, many believed it was Thor striking against giants. When the sun dimmed at midday, the people whispered of wolves chasing it, hungering for the light. A Viking man ploughing his field might pause when ravens gathered too many in number, fearing they were messengers of death. Even in the feasting hall, laughter and song could falter when firelight flickered strangely, or when a howl split the night beyond the walls. Yet fear was not the only gift of these tales. They gave meaning to courage, for every Viking man knew that to live bravely was to defy the fate that waited. If Ragnarok must come, if wolves must devour the sun and the seas rise in fire, then better to meet it with axe in hand and kin at your side. In this way, the omens did not crush hope, they sharpened it, as a whetstone sharpens steel. Feasts carried both celebration and solemnity. Viking food was laid upon long tables, roasted boar, dark bread, and mead foaming in horns. But between songs of victory, the skald returned to darker verses. He reminded them that gold could turn to ash, that kings could fall, and that even the gods themselves would one day perish. Mothers listened, their hands upon their children's shoulders, teaching them through silence that to live was to prepare for the end, to endure even when doom was certain. And still, the sagas grew. Ghosts of warriors were said to walk the barrows, their voices sighing with the wind, warning of wars yet to come. Some Viking children swore they saw shapes in the night sky, dragons, wolves, or ships of flame sailing across the stars. Whether true or born of dreams, the people believed, for belief itself was power. Thus, the legends and dark omens shaped the heart of the North. They filled the nights with fear and wonder, with shadows and fire, and they reminded every Viking man and child that life was fragile, fleeting, yet glorious when lived without cowardice. And so, with each dawn, the people of the North rose again, choosing courage, choosing song, even as serpents waited and Ragnarok loomed on the horizon. The storm did not rise from the fjords this time, but from the green valleys of Normandy, where the blood of raiders had taken root in foreign soil. The Normans were born of Vikings, who had traded sails for castles, longships for horses, yet the fire of the North still burned in their veins. They spoke a new tongue, wore foreign garb, and prayed to Christ beneath cathedral spires, but behind their eyes gleamed the hunger of their ancestors. When the Norman storm broke upon England, it carried with it the legacy of Viking men who had once struck the same shores with axe and flame. William, called the Bastard by his enemies and the Conqueror by his descendants, bore the iron will of both warrior and king. A Viking man might have seen in him the shadow of his forefathers, for his rule was carved not by birth alone but by steel. He gathered knights clad in mail, archers with longbows, and ships broad enough to carry horses across the narrow sea. It was no raid for silver, no fleeting strike, it was conquest, thunderous and final. The English watched the horizon, and fear stirred in their halls. They remembered the Viking sails that had once darkened their shores, and now they saw a new host descend, banners flying, horns blaring, shields flashing in the Sunday. To them, the Normans were not strangers, but the storm reborn, descendants of raiders come not for plunder, but for thrones. The Viking child, in a northern hall, listening to tales of Hastings, would one day understand the blood of his people had crossed seas and centuries, shaping kings in lands far from their own. The Battle of Hastings roared like a saga. Shields locked, spears thrust, and arrows fell like rain. Harold Godwinson, England's king, fought with valour, but the Norman cavalry thundered again and again, hooves shaking the earth. At last, with an arrow to the eye and chaos in the ranks, Harold fell. And with him fell the last Saxon crown. The field was strewn with the dead, the air heavy with the stench of blood, sweat, and trampled soil. Yet from that carnage, William raised his banner, claiming England as his own. When the dust settled, England was forever changed. Castles of stone rose where wooden halls once stood, their walls casting shadows over villages. Norman lords took lands and titles, their rule sealed by parchment as much as by sword. Viking food still simmered in pots, stews of lamb, bread, thick with grain, but it was now served beneath the watch of foreign masters. The Viking man who remembered the Danelaw might have seen in this conquest a bitter echo. Their kin had once carved law here with axe and oath, and now their descendants had returned to claim it anew. Yet the storm did not erase the past, it carried it forward. In every Norman, the memory of raiding ancestors stirred, and in every English field they ruled, the saga of the Viking lived on, though transformed. The Norman storm was the last great echo of the age of raids, proof that the blood of the North could conquer not only villages and monasteries, but crowns and kingdoms. And so, from Normandy to England, the Viking legacy thundered once more, reshaping the destiny of nations beneath its relentless storm. The wind off the Sussex coast carried the smell of earth and salt, mingled with the iron tang of blood. Hastings was no mere battle, it was the breaking of an age. Here, on this field of mud and death, Viking Britain met its twilight, and the shield wall that had stood for centuries finally splintered beneath the weight of foreign kings. To the warriors who fought, it was not only thrones at stake, but the soul of a people, their sagas trembling on the edge of silence. The English host gathered upon the hill, their ranks bristling with spears and shields. Many bore the blood of the North in their veins, descendants of those Viking men who had carved the Danelaw into England a lifetime before. They stood firm in the old style, shoulder to shoulder, their round shields overlapping like scales, their axes ready to fall. The cries of war rose into the sky, harsh and familiar, echoing the same roars that once thundered from longships onto Saxon shores. Among them, a Viking child, grown to manhood, gripped his father's axe, knowing he fought not only for Harold Godwinson, but for the memory of kin who had raided and ruled these lands. Below, the Normans surged forward, their banners snapping, their knights clad in mail astride massive horses. To the English, it was a storm unlike any other. Never before had the shield wall faced such relentless thunder, charge after charge, hoofbeats drumming like the wrath of Thor, lances piercing shields that once seemed unbreakable. The Viking man in the line gritted his teeth, pressing shoulder to shoulder with his brothers, the weight of his shield biting into his arm as the wall held. Arrows darkened the sky, striking down men who had stood tall moments before, yet still they endured. The battle raged for hours, the earth churned to black mud by blood and hoof. Viking food had filled bellies that morning, bread, cheese, dried fish, but hunger was forgotten in the fury of the fight. Thirst burned, arms ached, yet no man stepped back. Songs would later tell of their courage, of the shield wall that stood against the storm. But as dusk neared, fate turned. Harold fell, struck by arrow and blade, and with him the line wavered. Cracks spread through the wall, once so strong, and the Normans poured in like water through a broken dam. What followed was ruin. The cries of the dying carried across the hill, mingling with the clash of steel and the screams of horses. Banners toppled, shields splintered, and the old ways crumbled. Viking Britain, shaped by generations of raiders turned settlers, by law carved with axe and oath, gave way to the rule of Normandy. Castles would soon rise, stone upon stone, and the sagas of the north would be sung more softly, their echoes fading beneath foreign tongues. Yet, even in defeat, the spirit endured. The Viking man who fell at Hastings carried with him the honour of his kin, his blood seeding the soil of a land once conquered by his fathers. The Viking child, who survived, heard the skalds tell of that broken wall, and though the story was one of loss, it was also one of defiance. For though Britain bowed to foreign kings, the memory of the North lived on, carved into place names, into law, into the very bones of the land. And so, Hastings became not only an end, but a reminder that the Viking spirit does not vanish with the fall of a shield wall, but lingers like the tide, eternal and unyielding. When the last oars fell silent, and the dragon-proud ships no longer cut across foreign seas, one might have thought the saga of the North had ended. Yet the truth was far different. The Vikings left behind more than ashes and tales of terror. They carved themselves into the very bones of the world. What endured was not only gold taken or towns burned, but the lasting echo of their laws, their bloodlines, their place names, and their spirit, humming still in stone, song, and memory. In the fields of England, a Viking man's legacy was heard in the very words spoken by farmers. Place names clung to the land like roots: By for village, Thorpe for hamlet, Beck for stream. Every tongueful of speech carried the memory of settlers who had once stood with axe and plough. A Viking child born centuries later might not know the stories of raids or kings, but as he called his home by such names, he unknowingly carried their shadow. The language itself became a saga, whispered across generations. The laws, too, remained. The Dane law may have faded, but its customs lingered: oaths sworn upon sacred objects, assemblies where free men gathered to decide disputes, the weight of kinship in judgment. A Viking man who once stood in those courts would have recognized the rhythms of fairness and duty that lived on long after his bones had turned to dust. Kings came and went, foreign crowns ruled from afar, but the habits of justice rooted in Viking law could not be uprooted so easily. Bloodlines spread like rivers branching through the land. From Scotland to Normandy, from Ireland to Kiev, the seed of the north flowed through noble and common alike. A Viking child might grow in a stone castle, speaking French or English, yet in his eyes burned the same glimmer that once stared out from beneath a fur-lined helm. Even royal thrones carried this inheritance. Kings who claimed descent from raiders and settlers, their banners fluttering with both new crests and ancient echoes. And in the quiet places, memory sang. Skalds may have passed, but their sagas endured in vellum and verse, carried by monks who once trembled at the sight of sails. Stones carved with runes still stood in meadows, their lines etched with names and prayers that defied the centuries. A Viking woman's weaving pattern lived on in distant embroidery. A Viking food recipe, fish salted, bread baked black, still found its way to the tables of farmers whose ancestors no longer knew their names. What endured was not the roar of battle, but the hum beneath it, the slow, steady resonance of a people who shaped the world with both fury and craft. The Viking man who once strode across Europe left footprints that never washed away, and the Viking child who once dreamed by the hearth left descendants who walk still, their blood-carrying songs older than memory. Thus, even when the oars lay still and the sails rotted in forgotten fjords, the North remained alive. It lingered in lore and land, in name and song, in the way the wind itself seemed to whisper through stone ruins and rolling hills. For the saga of the Vikings was not just of raids and fire, it was of endurance, of spirit, of a people whose echoes will never truly fade.